It was a peaceful afternoon in March 1976 in New Mexico. The sun was already setting over the arid lands near the city of Gallup, and the desert's golden light reflected off the red slopes. In that vast and silent landscape, Mary Two Feathers, a 34-year-old Navajo woman, was walking alone by the edge of State Highway 491. She had spent the day visiting a sick friend in a nearby community and was returning home along a path she had known since childhood, the same one she used to walk with her father during the tribe's ancient ritual walks. The wind was light, the sky was clear, and nothing indicated that this would be the last sunset of Mary's life. At 8:20 p.m., according to the police report, a speeding car appeared on the road. Without warning, it swerved off the lane and hit Mary from behind. The impact was violent. The vehicle disappeared into the dark without stopping to help, leaving the victim lying on the side of the asphalt. The collision caused multiple fractures and severe internal bleeding. Minutes later, a truck driver named John Miller, a mining technician returning from work, noticed something on the shoulder and stopped to check. He found Mary still conscious, breathing with difficulty, but with her eyes open. Miller, a man of few words and firm gestures, took his jacket, covered the woman's body, and held her hand while calling for help on the radio. The ambulance was on its way, but it would take time. He tried to keep Mary awake, repeating that everything would be all right, that she needed to hold on. She looked at him intently and tried to speak. Her voice was weak, but her words were clear. "If you ever go to the reservation, tell my mother I'm okay. Not just okay, but happy, because I'm with my father." Miller, confused, replied that she herself could tell her mother soon, that she just needed to hang on a little longer. But Mary smiled, a light, almost serene smile, and looked away. She fixed her eyes on a distant spot, as if watching someone invisible. It was then that her expression changed completely. The fear disappeared, replaced by something Miller would later describe as absolute peace. She mumbled a few words in Navajo, a language he did not understand, and shortly after said in English, "He is here. The man with white feathers and calm eyes. He's calling me home." Seconds later, Mary Two Feathers lost consciousness. Miller tried to revive her, without success. When the paramedics arrived, about 15 minutes later, they confirmed she had passed away. For Miller, that moment was indelibly etched in his memory. He didn't understand what he had seen, but he knew there was something unusual about that death, something that went beyond the brutal randomness of a hit and run. Thus would begin one of the most enigmatic stories recorded in the archives of Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, a case that, decades later, would still raise questions about the boundary between life and death, body and consciousness. The rescue team arrived at 8:35 p.m. The paramedics quickly examined Mary Two Feathers, confirming what John Miller already feared. Her vital signs were almost non-existent. The impact had caused severe internal damage, and even if help had arrived minutes earlier, her chances of survival were minimal. Still, they attempted resuscitation procedures for over 10 minutes. Miller remained standing next to the ambulance, unable to look away. That image, the woman's body illuminated by the rotating red lights in the middle of the desert darkness, would stay with him for the rest of his life. In the official report, the case was classified as a hit and run and filed with the Gallup Police Department. But for Miller, what he had witnessed transcended any bureaucratic explanation. The most vivid memory was not the accident itself, but the moment Mary uttered those words. "He is here, the man with white feathers and calm eyes." Her expression had changed from pain to serenity, as if she had recognized someone. It was at that moment, he claimed, that something imperceptible seemed to pass through him, a subtle current that went up from his hand to his chest, causing a real physical sensation, difficult to describe. In the following days, Miller had difficulty sleeping. He felt shaken, but also deeply touched by something he didn't understand. He reported the incident to the police and then to the local hospital medical team, who recorded his testimony along with the official case documents. None of them gave importance to the spiritual part of his account. For them, Mary's last words were just delusions caused by trauma and blood loss. However, in the following weeks, the story would take an unexpected turn. During the investigation, officers managed to locate Mary's family on the Navajo reservation. When they went there, they discovered that on that same afternoon, exactly 1 hour before the accident, her father, Samuel Two Feathers, had died suddenly of a heart attack. The medical record marked the time of death as 7:15 p.m., confirmed by 2 witnesses. He was a respected man in his community, known as a healer and traditional storyteller. The fact that father and daughter had died on the same day, with just over an hour's difference, would have been notable on its own. But what impressed the officers, and later Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, was the content of Mary's last words, which seemed to indicate that she knew about her father's death even before she passed away. John Miller only learned of this coincidence days later when he read the news in the local newspaper. Upon recognizing Mary's name, a shiver ran through his body. At that moment, he understood that her last words, "My father came for me," might not have been a metaphor. What happened on that road in New Mexico would not just be an isolated tragedy. It was about to become one of the most intriguing cases ever studied on near-death experiences, catching the attention of one of the leading researchers on the subject, Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. When the news of Mary Two Feathers' death reached the Navajo reservation, the community plunged into a heavy silence. The tragedy of losing a young woman would, by itself, be a cause for great commotion. But the fact that her father, Samuel Two Feathers, had died just 1 hour earlier gave the event an almost supernatural dimension. Samuel was a respected man, known for his wisdom and for conducting traditional ceremonies of healing and spiritual passage. For many, it did not seem a coincidence that father and daughter had passed on the same day. Samuel's death certificate recorded 7:15 p.m. as the exact time of death. He had suffered a sudden heart attack while preparing medicinal herbs in his home, about 250 kilometers from where Mary would be hit shortly after. The reservation doctor, accustomed to dealing with emergencies in isolated regions, recorded the details precisely. There were witnesses, 2 women from the community who were present when Samuel collapsed and called for help immediately. There was no doubt about the time. The next morning, when the police finally arrived at the Two Feathers family residence to report Mary's death, her mother reacted unexpectedly. According to the officer's report, she remained silent for almost a minute before responding. Then, she calmly said that she already knew. She explained that, the previous night, while watching over her husband's body, she felt something unusual. A warm wind passing through the house, even though the windows were closed, accompanied by a strong smell of wet earth, an aroma that, according to Navajo traditions, symbolizes the presence of spirits in transition. Later, she would also report hearing her daughter's voice whispering in Navajo, "Father is here." At first, she attributed this to the stress and pain of grief, but when she heard about Mary's last words, she was in shock. The coincidences were too many to ignore. Another detail emerged during the conversation with the authorities. The night before the accident, Mary had called her mother and recounted a dream that had disturbed her. She said she had seen a dark bird fall from the sky and then be reborn as a white bird that flew again. The mother, accustomed to the dream symbols of the Navajo tradition, interpreted that as a sign of transformation, the type of vision that, according to ancient stories, announces a spiritual crossing. These accounts, gathered in the following days, caught the attention of local researchers and journalists until they reached the knowledge of Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. Known internationally for her pioneering work on death and the dying process, she had already begun documenting accounts of near-death experiences in different cultures. The case of Mary Two Feathers with its simultaneous and verifiable link between two deaths, stood out for combining spiritual elements with objective data, confirmed times, independent witnesses, and consistent details. When Kübler-Ross received copies of the testimonies and official reports, she realized she was facing something uncommon. For her, that story was not just about death, but about connection, an invisible link that somehow seemed to have united father and daughter beyond the limits of the physical body. And it was from this extraordinary coincidence that a scientific and human investigation would begin, one capable of questioning our most basic ideas about what truly happens at the moment of death. While the authorities were concluding the bureaucratic part of the case, the news of the deaths of Mary and her father spread quickly among the Navajo communities in the region. For many tribal members, what had happened was not just a family tragedy, but an event laden with spiritual meaning. The simultaneous death of two people connected by blood ties, especially father and daughter, was seen as a sign of a joint transition, something that, according to the oldest traditions, occurred when two spirits were destined to cross the path home together. Mary's mother, who remained secluded during the days of mourning, told close relatives that she continued to feel the presence of her husband and daughter in the house. She described small phenomena: the sound of light footsteps during the night, the gentle sway of ceremonial feathers hung over the fireplace, and the same scent of wet earth she had smelled at the time of her husband's death. For Westerners, this could be explained as emotional manifestations of grief, auditory or olfactory hallucinations caused by pain. But for her and her community, it was a dialogue between worlds. Among the elders, the comment soon spread that the spirit of Samuel Two Feathers had returned to fetch his daughter. One of the oldest members of the tribe, who had participated in rituals with Samuel for decades, stated that the healer was known to carry the title of Man of the White Feathers, an honor granted only to healers who completed a certain degree of spiritual learning. During ceremonies, Samuel wore a simple headdress made with white eagle feathers, the very detail Mary mentioned in her last moments when she told John Miller, "He is here, the man with white feathers and calm eyes." The coincidence between Mary's description and the way her father was known in life caught everyone's attention, including Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross when she later read the full account. The Swiss psychiatrist, based in the United States, had been dedicated to studying cases where patients close to death reported encounters with deceased people. Her interest was scientific, not religious. She sought to understand whether such experiences could represent universal manifestations of human consciousness in the face of the end of life. Meanwhile, John Miller, the man who had been by Mary's side in her last minutes, tried to get on with his routine, but couldn't. He returned to work in the mines, but the images of that night would not leave him in peace. Sometimes he woke up with the feeling of being back in the desert, hearing the wind pass between the stones and feeling the same subtle warmth he had felt when Mary squeezed his hand. What he didn't imagine was that those sensations would be just the beginning. A few weeks later, the dreams began. Always the same scenario: a silent desert under the starry sky, and in front of him a Native American man wearing ceremonial clothes decorated with white feathers. The man watched him in silence, conveying an indescribable calm. Miller would wake up sweating, heart pounding, but wrapped in a sense of reverence he couldn't explain. He had never believed in anything spiritual. A Vietnam War veteran, accustomed to brutality and the cold logic of survival, Miller had always dealt with the world in a practical, direct way. However, since that night on the road, something in his perception had changed. Alcohol, which he had used for years as an anesthesia for the guilt and emptiness left by the war, no longer produced the same effect. Every time he tried to drink, he felt nauseous and a kind of moral discomfort. It was as if something inside him prevented him from continuing. His co-workers noticed the change. Miller, previously known for his explosive temper, had become quieter, more introspective. He spent hours in silence, gazing at the desert horizon, as if searching for answers in the wind. One day, a teammate who attended grief support groups mentioned the name of a doctor who worked with terminally ill people and traumatized veterans, Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. He explained that she not only treated patients, but also studied accounts of near-death experiences. Miller hesitated for weeks before seeking help. He told himself he didn't believe in any of this, but deep down, he felt he needed to understand what he had experienced. Finally, he decided to write a letter to Dr. Kübler-Ross, simply reporting the accident, Mary's words, and the dreams that haunted him. To his surprise, he received a personal reply a few weeks later. The doctor invited him for a consultation at her office in Chicago, should he be willing to talk. In the fall of 1976, Miller made the trip. It was the first time he had left the state in years. He carried a mixture of anxiety and skepticism, not knowing what to expect. In his diary, he wrote, "I'm not looking for religious comfort. I just want to know why a stranger died in my arms and left me with this feeling that something inside me was torn out and replaced by something else." When he finally met Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, he was impressed by the doctor's calm presence. She listened to him for almost 3 hours, without interruption. Miller recounted everything: the sound of Mary's breathing, the feeling of energy that passed through his body, her final smile, and the dreams that had haunted him ever since. Kübler-Ross took notes in silence, sometimes just asking simple questions about times, sensations, and emotions. In the end, she asked for permission to study the case further, including contacting Mary's family and accessing the medical and police records. Miller agreed, relieved to feel that, for the first time, someone was taking him seriously. For Dr. Kübler-Ross, that meeting would mark the beginning of one of the most delicate investigations of her career, one that would unite science, spirituality, and the human experience in the face of death. The meeting between John Miller and Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross marked a turning point for both. That fall of 1976, in her Chicago office, Kübler-Ross was already known worldwide for her work on death and dying, which had revolutionized the way medicine and society viewed the process of end of life. But she had also become one of the pioneers in the scientific study of so-called near-death experiences, phenomena reported by people who were clinically dead or near death and who, upon returning, described sensations of peace, intense light, and encounters with deceased people. John Miller was not a typical patient. He was a man with a hardened appearance, hands marked by work, and a tired look, typical of someone carrying heavy memories of the war. However, what impressed Kübler-Ross most was the sincerity with which he described what he had felt next to Mary Two Feathers. "It wasn't fear nor compassion," he said. "It was as if for an instant I saw what she was seeing." During the first session, which lasted nearly 3 hours, Miller recounted every detail: the sound of the impact, the touch of Mary's hand, her smile, and the feeling of a current passing through his body at the moment she looked into the void and uttered the words about the man with white feathers. When he finished, he remained silent, visibly shaken. Kübler-Ross took careful notes, without judgment. Her method was to listen before theorizing. In the end, she thanked him and said with her characteristic calm, "What you experienced, John, is rare, but not unique. There are documented cases of people who, upon witnessing someone's death, experience something we call empathetic transformation. It may just be an extreme psychological response, or perhaps something we don't fully understand yet." Miller felt, for the first time since the accident, that he was not alone. He accepted the invitation to participate in follow-up sessions and authorized the doctor to investigate the case in depth. Kübler-Ross requested access to the police and hospital reports from Gallup, as well as permission to contact Mary Two Feathers' family on the reservation. She wanted to understand if there was any cultural element that could help interpret the phenomenon. In the following months, the doctor traveled to New Mexico, accompanied by anthropologists and interpreters familiar with the Navajo language and traditions. She knew that any investigation in indigenous territory required respect and sensitivity. She was received with caution, but the reputation of her work in hospices and her humble demeanor opened doors. Mary's mother agreed to speak, provided that certain details remained confidential, not out of fear, but out of reverence for her people's mourning practices. These conversations provided the researcher with precious information. She discovered that Samuel Two Feathers, Mary's father, was known in the community as Man of the White Feathers, a title granted only to healers who achieved a high spiritual stage. During ceremonies, he wore an adornment of white eagle feathers and was described as having a calm gaze, exactly as Mary had said before she died. The precision of these descriptions led Kübler-Ross to write an observation in her files. Patient in terminal state describes figure of deceased father with symbolic and cultural accuracy in a context of simultaneous death confirmed by medical record. For her, that detail made Mary Two Feathers' case unique, not only for its spiritual content, but for the solidity of the chronological and documentary evidence. The study was just beginning, but it was already challenging the boundaries between medical science and the mysteries of human consciousness. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's notes on the Mary Two Feathers case grew quickly. What began as an isolated account was transforming into a multidimensional study involving neuroscience, anthropology, and the psychology of grief. The doctor was known for maintaining methodological rigor, even in the face of phenomena that escaped traditional explanations, and this case demanded a delicate balance between skepticism and openness. In her reports, she described three main lines of investigation: the physiological evidence of the accident, the cultural aspects of Navajo symbolism, and the psychological impact on John Miller. Each of these revealed something that, when added together, defied the simple category of coincidence. First, she officially confirmed the chronologies. Samuel Two Feathers' time of death, recorded at 7:15 p.m., was just over an hour before the moment Mary was hit, at 8:20 p.m. There was no means of communication between the reservation and the road that could explain how the daughter knew of her father's death. The cross-referencing of medical and police documents showed that the two events occurred completely independently, in distant locations, with distinct witnesses. Then came the symbolic dimension. Kübler-Ross discovered, with the help of Navajo translators, that the bracelet Mary was wearing at the time of the accident had the term Ashi engraved on it, which can mean return home or rejoin the ancestors. It was a handmade silver and turquoise piece of jewelry, a gift from her father at her coming-of-age ceremony. The fact that Mary wore it until the end of her life, and that her last words expressed exactly this idea of going home, deeply impressed the doctor. She also found that Mary's description, the man with white feathers and calm eyes, matched her father's appearance during rituals, something confirmed by several community members. For Kübler-Ross, this precision indicated that it was not just a common hallucination. In conditions of severe hypovolemia and trauma, the brain tends to produce fragmented, incoherent visions. But Mary's speech, according to John Miller's testimony, was coherent, emotionally integrated, and loaded with cultural meaning. At the same time, Kübler-Ross refused to jump to spiritualistic conclusions. In her notes, she wrote, "We must first consider neurological explanations. Cerebral oxygen deprivation can induce out-of-body experiences and familiar visions. The brain chemistry in extreme trauma generates a sensation of light and comforting presence. However, this case contains an objective element that escapes such hypotheses, the temporal coincidence and the prior knowledge of a distant fact." John Miller, in turn, continued with follow-up. The sessions with the doctor became not just clinical interviews, but a space for the reconstruction of meaning. He spoke of the recurring dreams with the desert and the man with white feathers, and reported that, since the accident, his relationship with life had changed. He gave up alcohol effortlessly, drew closer to indigenous communities, and began volunteering at a local hospice. Kübler-Ross called this phenomenon secondary transformation through empathetic impact, a profound change in the consciousness of someone who intensely and meaningfully witnesses the death of another human being. At a private conference with fellow doctors, she presented the case, omitting names but emphasizing the consistency of the data. "It's not about proving that there is life after death," she said. "It's about understanding that the human experience of death can reveal dimensions of the mind that we still don't comprehend." The Mary Two Feathers case thus went from a tragic event to a scientific question mark, an open window to the mystery of consciousness. Over the years, the Mary Two Feathers case became one of the most cited in Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's archives, not for offering proof of an afterlife, but for exemplifying the depth of the human mystery in the face of it. In her conferences and private manuscripts, the doctor mentioned the episode as a borderline case, a meeting between science, spirituality, and culture that exposed how little we still understand about consciousness. In her writings, Kübler-Ross maintained the posture that always distinguished her, the balance between scientific rigor and empathy. She admitted that phenomena like Mary's could have neurophysiological explanations, chemical discharges in the brain, hypnagogic hallucinations, time distortions caused by trauma, but insisted that even so, the subjective impact of these experiences was real and transformative. For her, the true scientific value lay in understanding what these experiences did to the people who experienced them and those who witnessed them. John Miller was one of those transformed people. The man hardened by war and alcohol became a volunteer in palliative care programs, working with terminally ill patients in indigenous communities. According to accounts from colleagues, he became serene, compassionate, and profoundly present. When asked why he dedicated his time to dying people, he replied, "Because I learned that death is not the opposite of life, it is a part of it." Kübler-Ross saw in Miller the reflection of what she called the lesson of death, the capacity to awaken compassion and purpose in those who face it consciously. She wrote, "The Two Feathers case demonstrates that the encounter with death can generate not despair, but transformation. Perhaps the mystery of death exists not to be deciphered, but to teach us how to live." In later lectures, the doctor often used this case as a bridge between science and ancestral wisdom. She said that cultures like the Navajo had preserved a broader view of existence for centuries, one that does not separate mind, body, and spirit, and that perhaps Western science had much to relearn from them. The symbolism of Mary's bracelet, the dream of the reborn bird, and the bond between father and daughter were not, for Kübler-Ross, just folkloric coincidences, but profound expressions of a consciousness that recognizes itself as continuous. She never claimed to have found proof of the soul's survival. On the contrary, she maintained intellectual prudence until the end. "I don't know if Mary truly saw her father. I cannot prove that human consciousness continues beyond the body." But something extraordinary happened that night, and to deny that would be dishonest to the mystery that science has not yet reached. The Two Feathers case remained in her archives until her death in 2004 as a symbol of a frontier still open. Decades later, it continues to inspire researchers, doctors, and laypeople to look at death with less fear and more curiosity. Because deep down, perhaps this is what Mary and John's experience teaches us, that love and consciousness can cross the limit of time, and that every life, however brief or silent it may seem, leaves a mark that continues to transform others. And now, after learning this real story, the question that Elisabeth Kübler-Ross herself liked to leave hanging remains. What changes in us when we understand that death is not the end, but part of a greater cycle of existence?